webinars to shine a light on the multiple issues that have aggravated the situation caused by the January earthquakes and how to best tackle them. And the idea is that these discussions help funders make better informed decisions, enable collaborations with other entities, and have a higher impact on the ground, which is what we all ultimately want. Today's webinar is titled Vacancy and Abandonment, a snapshot of a post-earthquake Puerto Rico. The objective of this seminar or webinar is to inform on abandonment and vacancy, particularly within the context of the natural disasters we've faced since 2017. Themes that will be discussed include the extent of vacancy and abandonment on the island, the causes and effects for this vacancy, the relationship between housing and natural disasters, public policy, and recommendations for moving forward. Our speaker is Luis Gallardo. Luis is the co-founder of the Center for Habitat Reconstruction, which is a nonprofit organization that promotes the adequate management of abandoned properties in Puerto Rico to foster community development. Luis is a lawyer who has worked for the past 15 years on public policy and state and municipal laws while focusing on housing, nuisance properties, and advocacy. There's more info on Luis on our registration page, so I welcome all of you to read it, check it out later. Due to our time constraints, we won't be able to read all of Luis' biography. Before we start, I will go over the format of the webinar. We have, Luis will present for 30 minutes or less. Then we'll have 15 minutes for questions and answers. The questions should be sent throughout the chat. And after that, that's basically the format. The webinar will be recorded so that people that would like to be informed about this topic and could not make it today can see it later in their free time. So with that, I'll leave it to you, Luis, to start the presentation.
Yes, good afternoon, everybody. Rebecca, am I coming in clear? I know we did a mic check prior. Just want to make sure I'm coming in.
Yeah.
Okay, excellent. Well, thank you everybody for joining. Today, as Rebecca mentioned, we're going to talk a little bit about the abandonment and vacancy problem here in Puerto Rico. But just to manage expectations and kind of give everybody an idea of what we're going to be talking about today on this slide, I'm hoping everything's transmitting fine. I can only see my PowerPoint from this end. We're going to talk a little bit about a particular case study and the particular project which gave birth to the CRH. We're going to talk about vacancy and abandonment in numbers. We're going to talk about the response from the local government. We're going to talk about another case study that we recently just finished wrapping up in Palo Seco, Toa Baja. We're going to talk about the particular post-earthquake challenges that we're facing. Some of them are new, some of them are resurfaced, and then we're going to talk about next steps, how different entities could possibly help and try to remediate this situation. So to kind of talk about, abandonment, I think it's good to rewind a little bit and emphasize a particular case that is what gave birth to our organization, the Center for Habitat Reconstruction, or CRH in its Spanish acronym. And it's very important because I think this particular case demonstrates, your run-of-the-mill abandoned property that we see on the corner of almost every street in Puerto Rico. What you see in this picture is a two-story home built quite some time ago, probably about 80, 90 years ago, in the neighborhood of Machuchal, Santurce. And this picture, it actually looks okay because the community had already picked it up, cleaned up, and cut the grass and so on. But the city years prior had sealed up the windows and closed up the property. So this property back in the 2000s represented a nuisance for the neighbors. It created all sorts of problems related to public health, security, safety, and so on. People would use it as a legal dumping site. Folks would vandalize the property or utilize the property to vandalize neighboring homes. And it was just a big problem. It was a problem property for the community. It had no apparent owners. And the neighbors were just fed up with this property, so they went to the city and started petitioning the city to take action on the matter. The property was declared a nuisance, but that did absolutely nothing to remediate the situation. It continued being the same ugly eyesore and problematic house for everybody. It just had a sign on it. So due to the lack of action or lack of movement on behalf of the city, the neighbors were just fed up and they simply started taking over the outdoors area of the property. They started cutting the grass, they started building or planting trees, community landscaping project and so on. And it got to the point where the neighborhood felt empowered. Community leaders and particularly the coordinator, Marina Moscoso, who's my co-founder for this organization, eventually just took the property entirely. The door was busted down. The community members started clearing out trash and started using the property for a space of community gathering. We have just some photos showing how people started cleaning up the backyard. They started cleaning up the vegetative waste, the construction waste, and so on, and started giving a little bit of order to the property, beautifying it. Later on, the community would paint it. You can see this is sort of a photo of how the property was eventually painted. And it's fascinating because if you look at the picture, it's sort of like a Polaroid photo of what they'd like to see the building one day, of how it could be. So you can tell it has windows now, it has doors. The property was utilized for neighborhood meetings. It was also utilized for arts and cultural events. Here's a photo of a collaboration with another project where they're reading stories, sort of like a theater story setting to children, and so on. So the property was utilized as a community space. It was previously a nuisance, and it later became sort of a meeting center for the neighborhood. So when the community members started looking into the property, okay, well, let's find a way for us to legitimize our activities in this property. Let's start looking into who it belongs to and how we possibly acquire it. And what you see here is a title study that was carried out regarding that property. And you can see that the owner had passed away. It says there 1986, and it had a number of all of that owner's children who each inherited a portion of this property. So each of these persons in turn themselves had children. Some of these folks passed away. Some of these folks have moved to different parts of the United States or maybe even other countries for all we know. And, you know, when you talk about, you know, this was 30 something years ago, 34 years ago, when you start multiplying the potential number of members of the succession, we're talking about, you know, dozens of potential owners of this property, none of which are taking care of it, none of which have demonstrated any apparent interest in repairing or utilizing the home and so on. So this kind of demonstrated to the community that there were title issues at hand. And sometimes there was even, you know, testament and succession issues. So when you started looking into the background of the tax debt, they noticed that the property owed much more its worth in tax. This is only a fraction of what its real debt was because it's been sitting vacant for decades. And just during that whole time, it's accumulating debt. And just due to the weird mechanism of how they calculate, you know, old property tax debt, some of it after a certain amount of years is I'm not sure if it's either written off or just doesn't show up on the current records, but this property was showing up almost $300,000 in tax debt. Now, property tax here in Puerto Rico, it doesn't just disappear. So whoever purchases the property would have to liquidate that tax. So if we're talking about a property that, you know, appraises for $69,000, nobody's going to pay $276,000 for a $69,000 home. So in terms of taxes, the property was not only not available on the market due to title issues, but even if it was, it's just not a cost viable project for people to assume. So sort of the tax code and the civil code and inheritance system kind of perpetuated the creation of nuisance properties such as this. And these are actual photos of the actual certificates and studies, just to give you an example of how this is for real. So the community noticed that the laws needed to change. So they organized a campaign called Todos Somos Herederos, which in English is We Are All Ears. And they started meeting with legislators. They started meeting with different public policy folks, people in the city and so on, trying to find ways to modify Puerto Rico's legal code to allow for properties such as this to obtain clean title, clear tax rolls, and be able to, you know, to transfer into either a nonprofit or a community or some sort of public use or public good and put it into productive use again. So due to this campaign, it was a very productive campaign. It was a successful campaign. They were able to approve Act number 157. This is an amendment to Puerto Rico's Civil Code, which stated that in cases where properties had no owners because the owners had died and they didn't leave any testament, or will, or they didn't leave any family members behind, there was no heirs, then if the University of Puerto Rico did not want it within a period, I believe, of 5 to 6 months, then the municipality would become the owner. So this was a very big step forward, and in the civil code today, that this mechanism still exists, and it allows cities to become the next in line to inherit properties when there are no living members of that family. During this whole time, it kind of initiated a lot of discussion in the legislature of different mechanisms on how we can start recuperating these abandoned properties, and that's when they approved Act 130. 130 had numerous proposals. It authorizes the creation of a community land bank for the municipality of San Juan. It authorized it fortified powers for the Rio Piedras and Santurce communities. It also created new mechanisms as to where if a city is going to condemn an abandoned property which has been declared a nuisance, its back taxes are deducted from whatever fair compensation. So in cases like Casa Taft, the city could very well condemn the property free of charge and take control of that property. So these are just two of the laws. There are a number of different mechanisms that kind of arose at this time, but you can see that there was an interest in public policy in dealing with this abandoned property issue. Here's a photograph of a city council meeting where after these laws were approved, Casa Taft was successful in convincing the city council to approve a resolution which allowed for the city to condemn that property that I showed you in the beginning of this PowerPoint presentation, acquire it, and authorize the transfer to the community group, Casa Taft 169 Inc. And here's another photo of some of the meetings that they had with different policymakers in getting these laws approved. So finally, the resolution was authorized for the city to acquire the property and pass it to the community. And the community was successful in obtaining a grant from a foundation statewide, the Art Place. And this is just a rendering of how the property is. We're hoping for it to look in the next few months. The property is currently undergoing construction with that assistance from that external foundation. And it gives you an example of how we can go from a property that was a problem, zombie property, to one of productive use and provides a space for community groups. So this was sort of like the case study in the pilot project, which gave birth to the Center for Habitat Reconstruction, because we started getting phone calls from other communities like, hey, how can I do this over here? We want to do the same. We have a museum, we have a garden, we have a housing center. How can we refit these abandoned properties and have community takeovers? So that's when, in kind of rolling this into the next agenda item, which is just abandonment in general. This is a photograph of the Paseo de Diego, which only 20 years ago was Rio Piedras, San Juan's prime economic center. And this was, bustling with activity. There were carts selling everything from food to clothes. Each of these storefronts were occupied. The second and third stories of these buildings had residents in them. And you walk through it today, and it's a very eerie ghost town. And what's very ironic about it is not only a few years ago was this quite active, but less than 10 years ago, the city government spent approximately $4.5 million in CDBG dollars rehabilitating the street. So there's also a loss of public investment, and it just wasn't enough. And I guess it might have been too late to save a street such as this. So when we start talking about, how the abandonment issue, we move beyond what we found on the Calle Taft, we move beyond what we find in San Juan, and we start looking all throughout the island. We start looking at the data. Fortunately, there's very limited data. We just have some kind of obscure U.S. Census numbers, which tells us that there's approximately 330,000 vacant homes in Puerto Rico. We're talking about 1.5 million homes, habitable homes in Puerto Rico. 330,000 of those are vacant. That's approximately about 22%. And we add to that an additional 300,000 homes, which are in ruin, which are not even available on the market due to these title or tax issues that we're talking about later. So if you were to factor these together, you were to add the 1.5 million to the 300,000 in ruin, we're talking about 1 out of every 3 structures in Puerto Rico is either vacant or it's abandoned. And, Alan Malik, which has published a number of studies on this matter, has dubbed these numbers as hyper vacancy, where it's just a spiral down and you start perpetuating these negative effects in the neighboring properties, which itself just creates more abandoned properties. Now, we've only talked about homes. There is an unknown amount of empty businesses, industrial spaces, and vacant lots, which are not counted by the US Census. So we don't even have any idea of how much square footage we're talking about on an average block and so on. And a recent phenomenon, which we've seen in the last 7 years, is the Puerto Rican government has been closing schools. Approximately half of all schools have been closed within the last 10 years. Within the last 7 years alone, there's been more than 600 schools that have been closed. And when you visit these schools, many of them are in dilapidated state. They're abandoned. They've been vandalized. They're falling apart. Some of them have suffered structural damage after Maria and the earthquakes. So when we're talking about here right now in modern Puerto Rico, the Commonwealth government is actually probably the biggest promoter of nuisance properties, because these schools are tens of thousands of square footage each. So right now we have a crisis regarding the abandonment of schools without any sort of reuse plan. So when we look at how city governments have been trying to address this issue, and despite the fact there are a whole new set of tools for cities to address abandonment, unfortunately, they're not being implemented. We did a survey of municipalities through our workshops that we do throughout the island, and we've seen that 67% of municipalities, they underrate their vacancy rates. We ask mayors and we ask their cabinet, what do you think the vacancy rate is in your city? And they give us numbers, and 2 out of every 3 underestimate the problem within their municipality. And just to give you an example of how many municipalities are really not effectively addressing these nuisance issues. In San Juan alone, there's estimated about 47,000 vacant properties, and only 90 of them have been officially declared a nuisance and are included in the city's official list of nuisance properties. So we're talking about like a 0.00 something 1% of properties that are vacant in San Juan have formally been declared nuisance properties. So that itself, I think that number speaks quite a bit. When we start talking to municipalities as to whether or not they've actually declared nuisance properties, only about 40% have. That leaves 60% that have not in the last 2 years declared nuisances. I remind you that all of these different mechanisms that exist for cities to retake these properties depend on the nuisance declaration process. It's a process which guarantees people's property rights, and it has its due process clauses and so on. So without declaring nuisances, none of these properties can have their title or their tax rolls cleaned by municipalities. And finally, we found that 1 out of every 3 municipalities might be addressing the abandonment issue by purchasing abandoned lots or purchasing buildings, but they're doing so without declaring nuisances, and they're paying full market rate for properties which do not need to be bought for full market rate. We're talking about properties that have been sitting vacant for decades, they're dilapidated, and that are public risks, but the cities unfortunately have not taken the steps to acknowledge that risk and declare them. So there's a lot of municipalities that are investing public funds and losing public funds, buying up properties for way much more than what they should be paying for. So that kind of gives you an idea of what the situation is right now on the ground with the cities. Now, we just finished wrapping up an inventory of abandoned properties in Palo Seco, in Toa Baja, in coordination with the municipality. And these are some numbers that have been really shocking for us. Like I said, we don't have too much data. This is our first case study. We right now are working on the Machuchal Santurce, Levittown, second section of Levittown and Toa Baja as well, and other communities which we're slowly adding to these case studies to see if we could start identifying tendencies across different communities throughout the island. But just to give you an idea, this is Palo Seco. It's a small coastal neighborhood in Toa Baja. Once upon a time, hundreds of years ago, it was its own municipality. So it has a nice little character to it. Nevertheless, we identified that there were 18% of abandoned structures. Now, this was a very difficult number to measure because we found a bunch of empty lots. And it's kind of, you can't compare apples to pears. I'm not sure if I even recited that saying correctly, but we have abandoned structures and we have abandoned lots, which are very difficult to quantify together. And not only that, but we also have a lot of lots where there are multiple properties on one lot. And, one property might be abandoned, one might not. There might be an empty, slither of land. So it's very difficult to measure. Our most effective one is just counting the number of structures there are in the property and then tabulating how many of them are abandoned. But that does not include empty lots and other particular situations. First view, when we look over the tax rolls, we estimate that 54% of these properties in Palo Seco have title issues. And that seems consistent with the number island-wide. These are problems where maybe individuals just, don't have clear title, or, they're kind of summed up in the following numbers as well, such as the 14% who have succession issues. These are properties that were owned by someone who we know passed away and who the records show that were passed away, but their succession never really stepped up to take the legal steps needed to clarify those titles. We also noticed that 23% of these abandoned structures were owned by who I call slumlords. And if they're the owners of dilapidated or substandard housing, then I can say with all confidence that they are slumlords. So 2 owners owned 23% of these properties. And there were absent owners who were not present in the community. They aren't members of the community per se. And they were pretty much just holding on to the land until someone either came and bought it up. We noticed that 21% of all of these properties are on third-party unauthorized land. This could either be through the so-called land invasions or land rescuing or sort of informal construction. About 21% of these properties are on third-party lots. And we also noticed about 5% of these properties are owned by inactive companies, which provides, very unique situation because they're not people who passed away. They were legal entities that disappeared. And, there are quite a number of those in the Palo Seco community. So this is just giving you kind of an idea of what you might find when you actually dig into the numbers, and it's a little bit more complicated than just someone walked away from the property. We're getting into a lot of tax issues here. We're getting into land grabbing. We're getting into unoccupied land transfers and so on, or unauthorized land transfers and so on. Then things get complicated even more when Puerto Rico gets hit by its wave of earthquakes. And I'm pretty sure you've had numerous webinars in the last few months that have gone into more detail. But this has provided a whole new set of challenges and has revealed a whole new set of obstacles that we find as well. When we look at the number of homes that were damaged, and I've been trying to find like an actual official statement. I could find just some news coverage that estimated up to 8,000 people have lost their home after the earthquakes in Puerto Rico during December and January. And if you factor these numbers in, we're talking about an increase of 3% in the number of blighted properties only from just 10 municipalities. And a lot of these southern municipalities already had some of the highest rates of vacancy and abandonment. So we're talking about an issue that was already in pretty bad shape, and then the earthquake absolutely did nothing to help it. So we're seeing an increase in stock of these blighted properties from just a very small slither of municipalities with a very big impact. Now, some of these new challenges, some of them are just challenges that just keep resurfacing after each and every one of these natural disasters that we've suffered in the last few years. First of all, a lack of recovery assistance. We've heard the nightmare stories of Hurricane Maria and Hurricane Irma of how families that don't have title issue, don't have clear title, or have difficulties in proving their property rights, just did not have access to many homes or assistance for their homes. This in itself perpetuates folks just picking up and walking away from these homes. People who lack these recovery assistance access programs will not return to their homes, and it'll just become another abandoned property. If you just go through Toa Baja and Palo Seco and you look at the Google Street View photos, you'll see a lot of these properties that today are just really dilapidated. You look at the photos only 3 or 4 years ago, and they were vibrant homes that had families living in them and so on. A lot of these homes, you would see that they're destroyed, and you'd see out of their mailbox, you'd see FEMA letters still poking out, and I'm presuming that they were denial letters. But so we are seeing this issue, this lack of recovery assistance does itself perpetuate abandonment of property. We also see the destruction of historic properties. One thing that's very unique about these earthquakes is when we talk about just standard lack of maintenance and abandonment, it's very difficult for a historic property, it happens, but it's difficult for historic properties to slide into the state of abandonment because there's very strict historic codes and the state has additional tools to take care of them. But earthquakes don't discriminate upon what buildings they desire or they destroy. So any of you can just drive through the downtowns of any of the municipalities that were impacted by the hurricane and see beautiful historic properties that were in pristine condition only a couple months ago are now stacks of rubble. And so this is one particular challenge which we've faced. Also, when we talk about questionable construction standards, I know that they're always talking about, a lack of, a building code, the implementation of an actual building code. We've talked about that a lot, but nevertheless, one thing that we see is for, one building style that might be convenient to protect us from hurricanes not necessarily is the same building style that protects us from earthquakes. We're talking about cement homes with cement roofs. Those are the homes that are going to be most impacted during an earthquake. So, we have to re-question ourselves whether or not we are using proper construction methods, even if we are utilizing, construction code standards and so on. And then we have the issue of displacement. A lot of these families are not returning to their home, especially if they have back tax issues or if they had mortgage issues to start with, or maybe even succession or title issues. They don't have access to any sort of insurance, so they don't have any access to any sort of disaster recovery assistance. These folks are not coming back to their home. They're either going to move into family members, they're going to move stateside, they're going to just turn into renters. They will abandon their homes, as we have seen in previous national disasters. So when we talk about next steps, again, how can we address abandonment issues here in Puerto Rico, but also how can we address abandonment issues within the context of disaster and specifically earthquake recovery? Well, there are a lot of excellent nonprofit community groups and foundations which are supporting different housing repair or relocation or construction programs. One thing that I always emphasize is that these programs need to accommodate title issues. And just to give you an example, Habitat for Humanity is fixing homes. There are other nonprofits that are repairing homes that families might have been denied FEMA assistance because they did not have clear title, or at the moment they could not prove that they had clear title. Work with those families, explore what property rights they do have, and try to work with those families and accommodate those families, because families, unfortunately, they're denied by FEMA, and I see sometimes nonprofit groups that also are denying families because they're having difficulty in proving their title. So you have to give a little bit of extra push and assist families and be a little bit more sensitive towards the variety of property rights here that exist in Puerto Rico. Now, title assistance programs, lots of people think, well, the immediate need is, brick and mortar. I need a roof over my home. The title assistance is something that's a little bit more complicated and it takes long time. But a lot of these families don't have access to federal assistance, or don't have access to things such as insurance and so on, simply because they don't have their property rights well defined, or they lack clear title. Particularly with succession related cases where the house belonged to my grandfather or it belonged to my great grandfather and there's 20 owners. Those are the cases that need the most assistance when we talk about title assistance. Title assistance will make sure that these families have a better chance of opting into assistance to rehab programs and things of the sort. So that's always a problem that, if there is no clear title and there's damage which can be remediated, lots of these families might pick up and leave, and we have another abandoned property. We need to promote new methods that are resilient both to hurricane and earthquake. As I was stating, we saw this flood of assistance for home repair, and I would like to see, if any of those homes have been able to withstand the earthquakes on the south end. So we do need to start exploring alternate methods. I'm not a construction expert, so I really could not go into, what different alternatives exist, but there are some very creative methods out there that I think we should explore. And also the community planning models. As we've seen, the city governments are doing a terrible job, frankly, in addressing abandonment issues. They're strapped for cash, they're having their fiscal issues, they have their political instability every 4 years and so on. So it's through cases such as we saw with Casa Taft and community-led development models, which will allow for these abandoned properties to slide into productive use. As I noted, there's a number of laws which now permit for communities and associations and nonprofit groups and community development organizations to gain access to a lot of these properties. And unfortunately, we can't sit around and wait for city governments to decide what to do with these. We need proactive communities who are knowledgeable of the situation and who can themselves inventory their neighborhoods, identify problem properties, identify the legal status, and themselves advocate for these properties to come back into productive use. So that more or less is a summary of the situation here in Puerto Rico, how it's been worsened by the earthquake, some of the things that can be done, and some of the challenges that we faced. I believe I'm hitting that 30-minute mark, so I'd be more than happy to answer any questions or doubts that might have arisen.
Thank you, Luis, for all the information and also for sticking to time. So now we're going to open up the session for questions and answers. If anybody has any questions, please direct them through the chat so that we can read them out loud and we can answer them. So while we get questions, I have one, Luis, that I can start with. Is I was speaking to Marina and you recently about the changes that are being made or proposed to the Puerto Rico Civil Code, and one of the policies that you had mentioned at the beginning were in danger of being flushed out of the code. And I was just wondering if that's still in danger, and if it is, what can be done, or what can be done to help, to impede that.
Yes, I think especially for those who are tuning in from Puerto Rico, we're used to perpetual discussion every 4 years of the civil code being amended. And I think we've gotten used to people talking about how the civil code's going to be amended, civil code's going to be amended. I think there's even like a permanent legislative commission that just for the last 20 years have been revising the civil code. Nevertheless, in this term, about a year, maybe 2 years ago, a very sizable draft of the most recent civil code reform appeared, and it seems that it's going to be approved within the following weeks. And we were very alarmed because we saw that mechanism that would allow cities to recuperate abandoned properties through the inheritance mechanisms was taken out. So we were alarmed. We talked to a lot of our partners when we were invited by legislative commissions to come and talk about it. That was one of the things we always pointed out. Nevertheless, I believe 2 weeks ago, the most recent version came out, and fortunately they put it back in. So as it's being reviewed right now, that amendment, which is approved through Law 157, 2016, was reinserted into the new draft. And that's without getting into other chapters that could affect abandoned properties or property rights and so on. We're happy to see that Law 157 has been preserved. So at the moment, we're in there. We're good.
Okay. Well, that's good to know. Thank you, Luis. We have another question. It says if you have considered funds for brownfields to work with some of the properties.
Yes, we have, and I must be very honest with this. I have a lot of mixed feelings regarding the brownfields proposals. We have submitted a number of them. We have some very great friends who work both in the EPA and other nonprofits that deal specifically with brownfields issues. But some of the issues that I have is, when you look at the definition of what a brownfield is, it could be any property that has any sort of contaminants or perceived contaminants that can prevent that property from being rehabbed. And that could include asbestos or lead-based paint, which are contaminants that we find in many residential properties. Nevertheless, when you dig into the CFRs and the actual federal statutes, these programs are really geared towards wide-scale formal industrial projects. And especially when you start discussing on a one-to-one basis, reviewers in the EPA, they tend to shy away from single family homes that might have asbestos or lead-based paint, and they really kind of want to concentrate on these bigger programs that have a bigger impact. I know that El Caño Martín Peña obtained a brownfields grant, and I think that they were able to leverage the fact that they had city blocks or entire city blocks that were almost all abandoned. And I think they were able to argue for that larger scale. But when we're talking about scattered site abandoned properties, mostly unifamily homes in a residential zone, it's very uphill. And I'm speaking out of personal experience to try to make that argument to the EPA. I see that you look at all of their projects and they tend to gear towards very large projects. So not saying that it's impossible, and yes, we have submitted in the past proposals for the brownfields, and we'd love to continue working that angle, but it's not a magic wand, so it has its place and its use.
Okay, thanks. There's two more questions. The first one is regarding hurricane and earthquake resilient building. Are there groups that are adept at rehabilitating structures that may have been abandoned due to perceived safety risk that could improve their safety in case of either or both types of natural disasters? Did you get that?
Let me see if I got the question right. The question is whether or not there's other groups that are dealing with the specific construction. Yeah, I mean, I've heard of different groups who have explored recycling materials. For example, in the case of Casa Taft, when our original plan was to replace the roof with a wooden roof, which itself could be built in a resilient manner and so on. But yes, I've heard of other cases of folks building with bamboo, with recycled vagones. How would you say that in English? Shipment crates and so on. So I know that there are other groups out there that are utilizing alternative methods of construction and are being a little bit more mindful. I know that Habitat itself also is a little bit mindful about that, and they'll rehab wooden homes in a very safe manner that are hurricane resilient and so on. Again, I'm not a construction expert, so I wouldn't trust me with a hammer and a nail. But yeah, I know that there are groups out there doing excellent work.
Thanks. There's one more, two more. Yeah, the first one is, given the main reason for local governments for not doing inventories of vacant properties and public nuisances is money or their lack of, especially when a declaration does not mean an expropriation. How do you think it can be incentivized and enabled the listing of this kind of information?
Yeah. Well, yes, the biggest impediment we find when we start talking to local governments is the money factor. It really depends on how cities approach it, because it can be very expensive. It can be very time consuming and so on. Nevertheless, there are some best practices. There are particular laws, and I don't want to get into too much legal detail, but for example, most cities are declaring nuisances per a 2012 law, which is called Law 31, 2012. And it's actually the most expensive, most timely, most time-consuming, most expensive, and most complicated process. Nevertheless, there are alternate methods such as Law 222 from 1938 and the Municipal Autonomy Law, which provides a little bit more quicker routes. For example, a declaration under the 2012 law, the declaration has to be carried out by an engineer. When you're going to declare a nuisance, you have to serve the family as if it was a general court case. And at the end of the day, if someone is going to expropriate, it has to be done for market rate. So those are little corners that cities can cut to make it more effective. We are rolling out a pilot program, for example, in Toa Baja, where we've sat down with the city and we've created an ordinance which employs all of those best practices. And we declare nuisances in bunch. It could be 50, 60 nuisances in one blow. And again, if you're not talking about eminent domain or expropriation, there are some costs you do not need, such as appraisal. You do not need to appraise a property if all you're going to do is fine it, for example, or if the city's going to come in and clean it up and you're going to file the lien. So there are ways to cut corners. We actually do workshops throughout the island trying to teach municipalities the best way to do it, the cheapest way to do it. But you could drastically cut the cost by doing it through inventories as opposed to just scattered sites as they pop up. So there are ways to lower the cost, and that's information that municipalities unfortunately do not have.
And one last question. I'm reading it directly from the chat. So it says, I know there are many community groups that are interested in acquiring properties to create multi-purpose centers for use, not just for emergency, but the issue is being able to have resources for operating costs, like water, electric, insurance, etc. What are some financial strategies that you have seen to support operations? Yeah,
well, first of all, if nonprofit groups do want to acquire a sort of an abandoned property, the only way they could do it right now is through the city. So the city is the entity which has the power to declare a nuisance, to either proceed with a judicial sale or an execution or expropriation or whatever the case is. The city is the only entity that has that power. So all of this has to be negotiated through the city. In the case of Casa Taft, for example, it was a community project that was not connected to electricity, not connected to water. There were no monthly expenses. It was a very informal space, but it was being utilized. And by maximizing spaces with little resources, it was able to convince funders and foundations and organizations to obtain funding to upscale and actually create a formal and structure and so on. So, you know, unfortunately, cities do not have money. I've seen cities that have reached agreements where for the first year, I'll pay the electricity or I'll pay the water. In the case of Casa Taft, we included in that reconstruction solar panels and gray water collection systems to try to make the building as self-sufficient as possible. And it might have cost us a little bit more at the moment of requesting a grant or constructing, but long-term, you're going to have a self-sufficient off-grid building that's not going to depend on, you know, the city's graciousness or, you know, a water or electric bill. Yeah. So these are some ways that we look at lowering long-term costs, but yeah, they're sooner or later you are going to need at least some money to turn a community garden into a full-blown upscaled agriculture, factory, I guess. So yeah, those are some efforts that you could implement to kind of minimize those long-term costs.
Thank you. So I think those are all the questions for now. Thank you, Luis, again for. Oh, there's one more.
Sure.
Yeah. Okay. I'll read it and then you answer it. What would be your recommendation for some family or families in need of a roof and wishing to occupy a property that they have already identified as abandoned?
Well, just from the get-go, I think it's my legal responsibility and as a nonprofit 501c3 to remind everybody that occupation is illegal. Here in Puerto Rico, we have a penal code which specifically states that occupying someone else's property is illegal. Nevertheless, our legal code provides a ton of gray areas, and when you start thinking about how many families here do not have clean title, then we have to ask ourselves, what portion of our population is living illegally in their lot? So, again, the municipality is the entity that has the powers to acquire these properties. There are properties that may be abandoned that they're in okay situation that a municipality could land bank and then transfer to families of low income. The municipal autonomous law provides for cities to donate property and money. So they could, in theory, donate homes to these families. But my suggestion to these families would be to investigate as well as you can to make sure that you're clear on the title issues and the tax issues, because the last thing you want to do is occupy a property, invest your own money, and live it, and then a year later the owner pops up and says, you need to get out, and you have absolutely no claim to the repairs that you made. So it's a very precautious procedure. And it really does require a lot of homework, and you have to know what your rights are. And for that could be a webinar of its own.
Yeah, certainly. So, okay. Thank you again, Luis.
Actually, and I saw someone ask for the presentation in PDF. So I could provide that as well, and I'll channel it through Rebecca.
Yeah, we'll be sending it. We'll be emailing everyone who was on the participating in the webinar. We'll be emailing everyone the presentation and the information for next week's seminar, which will be the need for access to design trade professionals for people to build their homes up to code, and the government's role in facilitating that access or connection between people and professionals, which one could ask oneself, there are professionals out there that could help, and there's people in need, but how come they don't connect? So we're exploring what are some of the public policies in place that benefit or hinder that connection. So that's for next week. So again, thank you all, and have a great afternoon. Bye-bye.
Thank you all.
Thank you.